In this learning module, I will be teaching you some tips for how to read for writing. You'll be doing a lot of reading in preparation for writing term papers at UOIT, and the purpose of this learning module is to give you some strategies that you can use to make your reading more efficient in preparation for writing term papers. We have already covered relevant topics in the class. We had a learning module on the social science library, so you should be experienced now in finding relevant literature. And we had a learning module on thesis topics, so you should be experienced at developing good thesis statements. So we're going to start with the idea of having already developed a thesis statement and already done some search of the social science library. The specific thesis statement that I'm going to be working with for the purpose of this demonstration is that high stress conditions impair the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. This is a topic that's of great interest to me. I do work on eyewitness testimony, and as I've mentioned earlier, it's always easier to work on a term paper if the topic is of interest to you. I've also done some searching of the relevant literature in the social science library, and for the purpose of this demonstration, I have selected 3 articles that I'm going to use. One is this article by Morgan and colleagues entitled "The Accuracy of Eyewitness Memory for Persons Encountered During Exposure to Highly Intense Stress." Another article I'm going to use is this article by Brown entitled "Eyewitness Memory for Arousing Events, Putting Things into Context." And the third one I'm going to use is this article by Leinfeld, "Descriptive Eyewitness Testimony, the Influence of Emotionality, Racial Identification, Question Style, and Selective Perception." So what I'm going to illustrate in this module is how I'm going to summarize the literature in these articles succinctly and efficiently in preparation for writing about them in my term paper so that I can address my thesis statement through literature review. Okay, the first thing I've done is I have created an article summary template. And this template includes the basic information that I'm going to want to get from each article, and I encourage you to do something very similar. So this is a template that I can use to summarize most any article. It includes the reference, which I would put in here in APA style. It includes 4 basic questions about the study, each study. What's the main purpose of the article? What hypothesis does it test? What does it add to the literature? That's the first bullet. The second is, what methodology did the researchers use? The third is, what did the authors conclude based on the results of their research? And the fourth is, how is this study related to my thesis statement? Does it support, fail to support, partially support, or is it partly is it even relevant to my thesis statement? So this is the template that I've started with, and then what I've done is, after I've read an article, or even while I'm reading an article, I'll complete that template for that article. So actually, when I read the introduction to an article, then I complete the first item on what's the purpose and the hypothesis. When I read the method section of the article, then I'll complete the section on what did they do. Then when I read the results and the discussion, I'll complete the section on what did they conclude. And then last, I'll complete the section on what does this mean for my thesis statement. So let me, without going through the actual article, let me show you the notes that I prepared on these articles. Okay, so here's a document that I have created where basically I reproduced my thesis statement here. Eyewitnesses to violent crimes make more memory errors as compared to eyewitnesses to nonviolent crimes. Okay, this is the thesis statement that ultimately I decided to work with. And then you'll see on the following pages I completed the article summary template for each of the articles that I read. The Morgan et al. Article, the Brown article, and the Leinfeld article. And I want to go over this in some detail and then show you how I use these summaries to make progress toward a term paper. So this will require understanding a little bit about the studies themselves. So the first article that I mentioned was by Morgan et al., and you can see that I've put the full reference up here. So first summary I wrote is, what is the main purpose of the article? And I wrote, Morgan et al. Tested the hypothesis that extreme stress impairs eyewitness identification accuracy. The study adds to the literature by creating a situation in which participants experience genuinely high stress. That was a unique feature of the study where they put people in very real stressful situations. What methodology did the researchers use? And you'll notice that each summary is written in my own words, and I'm putting the citation in here, and you'll see why later that's important to write it in a formal sort of way. And you can see actually that I'm starting to write my term paper by taking these notes. Morgan et al.'s participants were members of the U.S. military who were participating in survival school, that is, training in how to handle being a prisoner of war. After several days of food and sleep deprivation, participants were subjected to either high-stress interrogation with real physical confrontation or low-stress interrogation. Participants then attempted to identify their interrogators from lineups. What did the authors conclude based on the results of their research? Participants who experienced high-stress interrogation were less accurate in their identification decisions than were participants who experienced low-stress identification, but only when the interrogator, correct typos as we go, only when the interrogator was present in the lineup. When the interrogator was not in the lineup, the innocent suspect condition, both groups were equally accurate. So that's what they concluded. Well, how is this study related to my thesis statement? Does it support it, fail to support it, partially support it? Well, Morgan et al.'s study partially supports my thesis statement by showing that extreme stress impairs some aspects of identification accuracy, but not others. Recall that it impaired identification accuracy when the perpetrator, the interrogator, was in the lineup, but not when he was absent from the lineup. So you didn't read the original study, but you can see what I've done is summarize succinctly in my own words what that study did, what it found, what the authors concluded, and how it's related to my thesis statement. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the Brown article. And I've gone through the same process in summarizing the Brown article. So I've put the full reference here. I've summarized what's the main purpose of the article. The main purpose of Brown's study is to examine how high levels of arousal interact with context reinstatement procedures to influence the accuracy of lineup identification. Context reinstatement procedures are those procedures that are designed to try to reinstate the conditions surrounding the crime to provide cues to memory. So the study is unique in that it is the first to simultaneously study the impacts of arousal and reinstatement of context. So here again I've summarized what's unique about the study. Brown tested the hypothesis that high arousal impairs memory, but that the impairment would be offset by context reinstatement. So context reinstatement works to repair memory from high arousal. So what's the method that they used? Brown showed participants who were university students a series of slides of an event that was high arousal, neutral, or unusual. Half of the participants in each group underwent a context reinstatement procedure in which they saw a slide from the original event. The other half had no such context reinstatement procedure. All participants were then shown photo lineups and asked to identify persons centrally involved and peripherally involved in the event. So what did the authors conclude based on their research? In Brown's study, participants in the arousal condition had lower correct identification rates and higher false identification rates than participants in the other conditions. Context reinstatement, however, improved memory in the neutral and unusual conditions, but not in the arousal conditions. Thus, context reinstatement was not effective at improving memory for arousing events. Well, how is this study related to my thesis statement? Brown's study supports my thesis statement in that the arousal condition led to lower identification accuracy in both the perpetrator present and perpetrator absent lineups. And as an aside, performance did not improve through context reinstatement. So context reinstatement did not counteract the effect of high arousal. Okay, so as you can see, I've created another succinct summary of the article using the article template. Now let's turn to the third and final one, and that's the Leinfeld study. So that's Brown, and here's the Leinfeld study. And once again, I've read this, and after I read each section of the article, I write a summary of it. So what did we find? Here's the full reference that I'll use later. The main purpose. Leinfeld reported a study examining the influence of emotionality, which is like arousal, but also other variables, race and type of question asked on eyewitness recall. The study is unique because it combines, I'm going to correct our typos as we go, it combines the effects of separate conditions that have not previously been tested together, and because of its focus on eyewitness recall rather than identification accuracy. Leinfeld hypothesized that participants who viewed an emotionally charged event would recall it less accurately than participants who viewed a neutral event. There were hypotheses for other variables as well. So, what was their method? Leinfeld's participants were undergraduate students. They viewed videos of high and low emotionality crimes involving participants of different races and were asked questions about the crime. The questions were either misleading or neutral. So you can see each study combines a number of different variables, but critical for my thesis statement, the studies all manipulate some form of arousal or stress. So what did the author conclude? Leinfeld found that emotionality of the event significantly affected accuracy. The emotionally charged event was recalled less accurately than the neutral event, supporting their hypothesis. The results were replicated in a second study that was very similar to the first. Emotionality did not interact with other factors, meaning that the emotionality of the event impaired accuracy regardless of what the other conditions were. So how does the study relate to my thesis statement? Leinfeld's study clearly supports my thesis. Emotionality of the event reduces the accuracy of eyewitness recall. So once again, I've created a brief summary of the Leinfeld study, and I've created a brief summary of each of the three articles that I've reviewed. Now going forward, most of what I need to do with the term paper I can get from my notes, although I may have to turn back to the studies for some points. My notes can be very helpful in integrating the material to my term paper, and that's the section we'll turn to next, integrating the material for the term paper. Okay, so once you have your full set of notes on on the articles that you've reviewed, there's some interesting things you can do with these notes. And what I've done is I've essentially resorted the material in a way that I can really compare easily across the articles, because the goal of my term paper is to integrate this research and to address more comprehensively my thesis statement. So just as a reminder, my thesis statement is eyewitnesses to violent crimes make more memory errors as compared to eyewitnesses to nonviolent crimes. So I've summarized the 3 references here, and now what I've done, and now you see the benefit of writing the formal statements with the full citations as part of them so that you can compare across studies. So in this section, I took the 3 purpose sections from my summaries and put them right next to each other so I can directly compare and contrast the purposes of the studies. And right off the bat, I can see some similar sorts of things and some different things that I'd like to integrate into my paper. So for example, although my thesis statement has to do with violence, we're really talking, the 3 studies differ in some ways in what they focus on. Morgan focused on extreme stress, Brown focused on level of arousal, Leinfeldt focused on emotionality. So there may be some differences between those concepts, though they're all similarly related to my thesis statement. They also included different variables. Each study was not only interested in the effects of stress or arousal or emotionality, they looked at these variables in the context of other statements, other variables as well. So for example, the Brown study looked at context reinstatement, and the Leinfeldt study looked at factors such as race and type of question asked. So there's some comparisons and contrasts we might want to make there. There's another big difference here, and that's that the Morgan and the Brown studies looked at the effect on identification accuracy, whereas the Leinfeldt study looked at the effect on eyewitness recall. So that could be an important distinction I want to talk about in my term paper as well. Moving on to the methods. Here I've put the 3 method, my notes for the 3 method sections right next to each other, again allowing for easy comparisons across the studies. And you see some striking differences between these studies. The Morgan study was very realistic, using U.S. military personnel who experienced very real physical confrontation, high-stress events in certain conditions, whereas the other 2 studies, the Brown studies and the Leinfeldt study, used undergraduate student samples and more innocuous events, a series of slides in the Brown study and videotape in the Leinfeldt study. So in integrating this research, that's something I might want to discuss also, the different methodologies and the potential effect of these methods on the result. And this comparison has been facilitated by keeping the method sections, by putting the method sections together in this format. The conclusions I can also compare and contrast as well. We see that in the Morgan study, stress affects identification accuracy, but only when the interrogator was present in the lineup, not when the interrogator was absent. In contrast, in Brown's study, the arousal condition led to lower accuracy in both conditions, when the perpetrator was present and when the perpetrator was absent. So we're seeing different pattern of results between these studies. Is there something about the different methods, the fact that Morgan was a realistic field study and Brown a less realistic laboratory study, might that have contributed to the different results? Could it be something about the other variables that we found when looking at the purposes? Leinfeldt, remember, didn't study identification accuracy, but studied eyewitness recall. And what are we finding there? Leinfeldt is finding that emotionally charged event led to less accurate recall than a neutral event. So it's supported the hypothesis that high stress leads to less accurate recall. So we're seeing more similar results, even though Brown and Leinfeldt looked at different things. Brown looked at identification accuracy, Leinfeldt looked at eyewitness recall. We're finding a similar pattern of results from those two studies as compared to the Morgan study, which found only part support for the thesis statement. And maybe there's something about the fact that Brown and Leinfeldt studies were laboratory experiments, less realistic ones, whereas the Morgan was a more realistic study. So perhaps comparisons of the methodologies across studies tells us something about when we find effects for stress and when we don't. Now, how do the studies compare with my thesis statement? I get partial support for my thesis statement in Morgan's study and more clear support in the Brown and Leinfeldt study. So what have I gained by taking notes on the studies in this way? How has that helped me for my term paper? Well, it's helped me by helping me succinctly think about and summarize the studies. Second, by having short summaries of the purpose, the method, the findings, and the implications for my thesis statement, I can make direct comparisons across these studies and integrate the findings and find things to talk about in my term paper. We would not want my term paper to simply sequentially describe each study. Ideally, we want to be able to integrate the results, and summarizing the research has facilitated that. In sum, the purpose of this learning module was to help you develop strategies to efficiently read articles, take notes on those articles as you're reading them in a systematic way, and to manipulate basically the notes that you have to allow for careful comparisons across articles, comparisons of the purposes of the studies, the methods used, the findings, the conclusions, and how these studies individually or together support or do not support or partly support the thesis statement that you're writing about. Your term papers will be improved to the extent that you can integrate literature, that you can read multiple sources and draw general conclusions about them. And doing this requires efficient and effective strategies. And I hope I've helped you establish these strategies through this learning module.